She came back for closure. That was the lie she told herself for 400 miles. Because the truth, the real truth, was that 3 years ago, the man she was born to love stood in front of their entire world and chose his throne over her soul. Publicly. Permanently. In front of 500 witnesses, and she had walked away without shedding a single tear. Not because it didn't break her, but because some wounds are too deep to cry over. Now she's back, hidden in the shadows, watching him prepare to give his forever to someone else. She should leave. She's about to leave. Then a twig snaps under her boot, and Lucian Davila stops breathing in the middle of his own mating ceremony. His eyes find the dark, and somehow they find her. But here's what neither of them knew yet. Everything that destroyed them, every scar, or every sleepless night, every mile of silence between them, was not an accident. Someone did this to them deliberately, and that someone made one fatal mistake. They underestimated what she really was. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you won't see a single moment the same way you did at the beginning. And if this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you already feel it, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Because the kind of person who stays for a story like this, the kind of person who understands that some loves don't die, they just go quiet and wait, that's exactly who this channel was built for. Stay with me. It's about to get devastating in the best possible way. Chapter 1. The woman the pack buried. The night they cast her out, nobody cried. That was the part Eloise Parra remembered most. Not the words, though the words had their own particular weight, the kind that settles into bone and stays. Not the torches burning in their iron brackets along the ceremonial circle, casting everyone's face in shades of amber and shadow. Not even the silence, which had been the loudest thing she had ever heard in her 23 years of living. What she remembered, what she would always remember, was that nobody cried. Not one person in that crowd of 500 wolves moved toward her. Not one voice rose in her defense. They stood in their neat, obedient rows, and they watched, and the watching had a quality to it she could only describe as hungry, like they had been waiting for something to be confirmed, and now it was, and they could all go home satisfied. But she had stood at the center of the pack circle in her formal dress, ivory, which felt grotesque in retrospect, with the torchlight on her face and the whole weight of the Iron Veil Mountains pressing down from above. The air had smelled like pine resin and cold stone and, very faintly, like the particular kind of dread that lives in the body before something irreversible happens. She had known it was coming. She had known for 3 days, since Elder Cosimo Brandt had summoned her privately and shown her the diagnostic records and explained, in the careful tone of a man delivering news he has already made peace with, that she was a hollow. No inner wolf, no beast, no power, unfit for the bond, unfit for the throne, unfit in the clean, efficient language of pack law for the man the moon had decided was hers. She had spent those 3 days bargaining with herself, telling herself it wouldn't happen, telling herself Lucian would refuse, telling herself that whatever the council wanted, whatever the elders demanded, whatever the politics required, he would look at her across that circle and he would choose her. She had been 23 and certain of something for the last time in her life. Lucian had stood across from her wearing his new crown like it was already hurting him. Freshly crowned, 3 weeks into a reign he had inherited too young and too suddenly, flanked on both sides by the council of elders with their formal robes and their patient, watchful faces. He was 26 years old, and he looked like a man carrying a building on his back. His eyes had found hers immediately. She had let him look. She had given him that, us at least. She had not looked away, had not made it easier for him by disappearing into the middle distance. She had stood there, and she had let him see her face, and she had thought, with the desperate clarity of someone running out of time, "See me, just see me and change your mind." He had opened his mouth, and then he had said the words, "I, Lucian Davila, Alpha King of the Iron Veil, renounce this bond. You are not my mate. You never were." His hands were behind his back. Nobody saw them shaking. She had looked at him for 4 seconds after the words landed. 4 long, level, completely unreadable seconds. Long enough to understand that it was done. Long enough to memorize the exact expression on his face. Not cruel. She had registered that even then. Not triumphant or cold, but something far worse and far more complicated. Long enough to decide, in whatever part of her had already started building walls, that she would not give this moment her tears. Then she had turned and walked away. The pack watched. Nobody followed. 4 seconds. She had counted, though she couldn't have explained why. She still counted sometimes on bad nights in Caldervane when the wind came through the mountain pass, sounding almost like a voice. 4 seconds was the last honest thing they had given each other. She had walked out of the ceremonial circle, out of the Iron Veil, and out of her own life. And then she had kept walking for 400 miles. That had been 3 years ago. Now Eloise Para was crouched in the shadow of a collapsed stone arch at the edge of the ceremonial forest, and she was deeply, comprehensively reconsidering every decision she had made in the last 2 weeks. The arch was old, older than the pack, older than the Davila name, just 2 leaning slabs of granite that had given up trying to stay upright sometime in the last century and settled into a permanent state of dignified collapse. It was large enough to hide behind. It was positioned at exactly the right angle to the tree line that a person crouching behind it could see the glow of the ceremonial clearing without being seen herself. She had not planned this. She wanted that noted, even if only by herself, even if only in the privacy of her own increasingly alarmed interior monologue. She had not come back to Iron Veil with any kind of strategy. She had come because a letter had found her in Caldervane 3 weeks ago. A letter from an old man who was dying and had apparently decided that his conscience was more important than his safety. And the letter had said things that made it impossible to stay away. But she had not planned to hide behind a rock and watch the ceremony. That part had simply happened, the way terrible decisions often do, in a series of small, individually reasonable steps that somehow added up to crouching in a bush at midnight 400 miles from her mule. Caldervane. She thought about it now, with the particular ache of someone who has discovered that safety is its own kind of home. A small human settlement 2 mountain ranges west, so unremarkable it didn't appear on most pack maps. She had arrived there with nothing, no title, no wolf, no name that meant anything in that world, and she had built something from the nothing anyway. A room above the record keeper's office, a job transcribing land deeds and birth records, and the minutes of local council meetings so tedious they functioned as a sleep aid. quiet mornings with black tea and the sound of wind in the pines. A mule named Biscuit, acquired 6 months in, who was opinionated and occasionally attempted to bite people, but whom she trusted more than she had trusted most wolves she'd known. A life, small and honest and entirely, blessedly hers. She had come back for closure. She had repeated this to herself the entire journey. 400 miles on foot and a borrowed cart, and she's crouching in a bush. For closure. Sure, she could hear the ceremony beginning beyond the tree line. Was the low resonance of the ritual calls, the particular charged quality of the air under a blood moon. And it was a blood moon tonight, enormous and rust-red above the peaks, the kind that only came once a decade and called the pack together for the most sacred ritual in their calendar, the sacred claiming ceremony. She had known about it since childhood, had grown up understanding that it was the event around which generational history organized itself. True mates declared, bonds completed, the pack renewed. She had not at any point in those childhood lessons imagined she would be watching it from behind a collapsed arch while technically still exiled from the territory. She would watch for 5 minutes and leave. That was the agreement she had made with herself. 5 minutes, enough to see that it was real and done and final. And then she would walk back to the cart she'd left a mile down the mountain road, and she would go back to Biscuit and her land deeds and her quiet mornings, and she would be finished with this. She shifted her weight to her other foot. A twig snapped under her boot. It was not a loud sound. In the middle of a city, it would have been nothing, swallowed instantly by traffic and voices and the general noise of the world. But they were not in a city. They were in the ceremonial forest of the Iron Vale at midnight, where the only sounds were wind and ritual and 500 wolves with hearing precise enough to identify a heartbeat at 300 yards. In this context, the twig snap was approximately the volume of a thunderclap. She froze. Through the gap in the stone arch, she could see the clearing, the obsidian altar at its center, older than memory, carved with the pack's founding symbols. The assembled pack in their ceremonial formation, 500 strong, facing inward, and at the altar, Lucian. She had told herself she was prepared to see him. She had been wrong. He stood at the altar in formal black, the Alpha King's mark on his collar, the crown she had watched placed on his head resting against his dark hair like it had always belonged there. He was still the same in the ways that mattered. That quality of absolute stillness he had, the kind that didn't come from calm but from control, from something enormous being held on a very short leash. The jaw set slightly too tight, the shoulders carrying something invisible. Beside him stood a woman, Lady Vivian Cossart, Eloise had heard, daughter of the Western Ridge Grand Elder. On the political match the council had been engineering for 2 years. Beautiful and composed and exactly appropriate in every way that Eloise had been declared not to be. Every wolf in that clearing could feel that the bond wasn't singing. The air wasn't charged the way it should have been. The moon wasn't responding. Eloise could feel it from 100 yards away. The hollow quality of a ceremony going through its motions without the thing at its center that would make it real. But nobody spoke. Because Lucian was king, and the council wanted this, and sometimes the wanting of powerful people is louder than the truth. She watched him look up at the moon. She recognized his expression. It was the same one he'd worn the night he rejected her. Not cruelty, never cruelty, something worse. Grief dressed in duty's clothing. A man doing what he had decided he had to do and understanding, somewhere beneath all that control, exactly what it was costing him. The recognition moved through her like a blade, clean and cold and precise. That was why she had come back. Not closure, not the letter even. She had come back because she had never been entirely sure whether what he'd done had broken him too, and she had needed to know. She had needed to see it on his face with her own eyes. She had her answer now. She could go. She was turning to leave, weight shifting, hand braced against the cold stone, when Lucian went completely still. Not the careful stillness of control. Something older. Something that lived below thought, below decision, in the part of a wolf that predates language entirely. His nostrils flared. The gold bled into his eyes so fast it looked like ignition. Dark brown one moment, and then simply not. The amber spreading from pupil to iris like something locked behind glass had finally broken through. Vivian said his name. He didn't hear her. The head elder's voice rose in warning. He didn't hear that either. Because across 400 yards of ceremonial forest, through 3 years of silence and stone walls and the long, deliberate work of forgetting, his wolf had just recognized something the rest of him wasn't ready to admit. He stepped off the altar. The clearing erupted. Elders shouted, guards moved. Vivian reached for his arm and he looked at her hand with the expression of a man surfacing from very deep water. "Vivian," he said. Quietly, calmly, in the tone of someone who is approximately 4 seconds from becoming something the architecture couldn't contain. "Let go of my arm." She let go. He walked into the forest. Eloise ran. She ran the way people run when they have no wolf and no grace and 3 years of survival instinct that has never once steered them wrong. At full speed, crashing through undergrowth, branches catching her sleeves, zero dignity and maximum momentum. She had a head start. She knew this forest less well than he did, but she was fast. She had always been fast, and if she could reach the road... She rounded a tree and ran directly into Lucian Davila's chest. They both went completely still. Up close, in the moonlight, 3 years later, he was not unchanged. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. A tiredness that lived below the surface of all that controlled composure. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he had decided was a ghost and is now, with significant difficulty, reclassifying. She looked back at him. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. "Eloise." His voice broke on her name. Just slightly. Just enough. "Don't," she said. "How are you alive?" "Inconveniently," she said. "I'll leave. Pretend I was never—" "You've been in Ironvale territory for 2 days." She went still. "I could smell you the moment you crossed the border," he said. "I told myself I was wrong. I told myself it was a ghost." "It is a ghost," she said. "That's all I am here. I'll go." "You watched the ritual." "I shouldn't have." "I'm sorry." "You watched me." The blood moon hung enormous and red above them. The forest had gone very quiet, as if everything living in it had decided to hold its breath. "Why did you come back, Eloise?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said the thing she had practiced not saying for 400 miles. The thing she had promised herself she would only say if she was certain. The thing that had carried her across 2 mountain ranges and 1 very long stretch of bad road. "The healer," she said. "Bramwell. He told me everything, Lucian. 3 years too late. But he told me everything. Lucian Davila, Alpha King of the Iron Veil, the most feared wolf in 4 generations, went completely, utterly, absolutely still. And here, right here, is where the story you thought you were watching burns down. And a different one rises from the ash. Chapter 2. The Lie That Built 3 Years. The silence after she said Bramwell's name was not an empty silence. It was the kind that has weight, the kind that presses against the inside of a chest and makes breathing a conscious decision. Lucian stood in the moonlit forest with his eyes on her face, and something behind his expression that she had no name for. Not guilt exactly, not surprise exactly, something older and more complicated than either of those things. Something that looked like a man finally arriving at a destination he had been dreading for a very long time. It cost him something to hold still in that moment. She could see it. He was an Alpha King, and stillness was his first language. Control the thing he had been raised in like other children were raised in warmth. But this stillness was different. This was the stillness of a person gripping something very hard to stop themselves from reaching. He exhaled once, slowly. "How much did he tell you?" "Everything," she said. "He said everything." "Then you already know that I know." She had suspected. The way he hadn't flinched when she said the name. The way his eyes had gone not to denial but somewhere further in, somewhere that already had the geography of this conversation memorized. But suspecting and hearing confirmed were 2 different countries, and she felt the distance between them like a physical thing. "Tell me anyway," she said. "I want to hear it from you." He told her. 8 months ago, a letter had arrived from Bramwell Osei, the pack's oldest healer, retired 3 years prior, as dying of something that had apparently loosened his tongue, along with everything else. The letter had been 4 pages long and written in the careful hand of a man who had been rehearsing his confession for years and was finally, at the end of his life, ready to give it. It said that Eloise Para was not a hollow, had never been a hollow, that the diagnostic records Elder Cosimo Brandt had presented to the council, the records that had formed the entire basis for the rejection, for the severance, for the verdict that she was unfit, had been falsified, fabricated with the particular confidence of men who have never expected to be questioned. The truth, Bramwell wrote, was a condition called veiled emergence. Extraordinarily rare. Documented only 3 times in recorded pack history. Not an absence of wolf, but a delay, a suppression, a natural in origin, in which the inner wolf lay dormant until the conditions for its emergence aligned. In Eloise's case, Bramwell believed, the shift would have completed within a year of her mating bond being finalized. She had a wolf. She had always had a wolf. They had known, and they had looked her in the face and told her she was nothing. Lucian received that letter on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 council elders had been placed under formal arrest pending investigation. By Wednesday, Elder Brandt, 70 years old, the most senior and decorated member of the council, the man who had functioned as the pack's moral authority for 2 decades, had fled the territory entirely, which was its own kind of confession. And by Thursday, Lucian Davila, Alpha King of the Iron Veil, the most feared wolf in 4 generations, was sitting on the floor of his private war room holding 4 pages of dying man handwriting, understanding for the first time in 3 years that he had been a weapon. that the people he had trusted most had loaded him, aimed him at his own mate, and pulled the trigger. That every piece of his certainty, the certainty that had let him say those words in that circle with 500 witnesses, had been built on something someone else had manufactured. On the floor of his own war room, holding a piece of paper. "Did you know?" Eloise said. Her voice was very quiet. "Before the letter, did any part of you know?" The question landed between them like something set down carefully. "No," he said. She searched his face for the lie. She was good at finding lies. 3 years of recording human documents had made her extraordinarily good at identifying the small tells, the micro-hesitations, the places where a person's words and their eyes stopped matching. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He didn't look away, and he didn't try to make it easier. "No," she said finally, not a question this time, a verdict. "Not until that letter. And then you started planning. And then I started looking." He paused. "There's something I need to tell you about the ceremony." She waited. What he told her next was, and she would reflect on this later, in the quiet of a room with a door closed, with the luxury of processing it privately, genuinely one of the most unhinged things she had ever heard. The sacred claiming ceremony, Vivian Cossart. 8 months of visible, public, council-approved preparation for a political match. The Western Ridge Alliance, the formal announcements, the guest arrangements, all of it, the entire elaborate architecture of a king preparing to take a chosen mate, had been a cover. A deliberate, carefully constructed, operationally sophisticated cover for the actual project, which was finding Eloise. Because Brant had fled and taken his contacts with him. Because a king openly searching for his exiled, rejected former mate would have sent the wrong message to every political faction watching the Iron Veil. Because the best way to look for someone without anyone realizing you were looking was to appear completely occupied with something else. Lucien Davila had used an ancient sacred mating ceremony as a decoy operation. He had recruited Lady Vivian Cossart, who had her own reasons for wanting to appear publicly matched and unavailable, as a willing ally. He had spent 8 months conducting a search while appearing to plan a wedding. Unhinged? Absolutely. Romantic? That was a question for another time. Effective? She was standing directly in front of him in the ceremonial forest of the Iron Veil, so... "Vivian knows," he said. "She agreed to help. She has never been my chosen. She is in love with someone else and has been for 4 years, and that is a conversation she will need to have herself. But she is not a casualty of this. And I need you to know that." Eloise stared at him. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That," she said, "is insane." "Yes, you're insane." "Also yes." The sound that came out of her was not a laugh. It was not quite crying either. It was something that lived in the narrow space between those two things, a broken, half-involuntary exhale that she immediately pressed her hand over her mouth to stop. She turned away from him for a moment, facing the dark of the forest, giving herself 3 seconds to locate whatever composure she had left. It scared her, that sound, the connection in it, the way it had come out before she could decide to allow it. She turned back, and she took a step back, deliberate, a choice made with her feet that she didn't yet have words for. "You found me," she said. Her voice was steady now. She was very good at steady. "Now what? You say sorry and I come back? I become queen." my wolf wakes up and everything is simply fixed? I don't expect... I need you to listen to me, she said. Not as your mate, not as someone you owe an apology to, just listen. He closed his mouth. He listened. I spent 3 years, she said. 3 years building something from nothing. After the person who was supposed to be my other half stood in front of our entire world and told me that I wasn't worth the bond. I'm not saying that to punish you. I'm saying it because you are standing here with a plan, and your plan requires something from me that I am not certain I have anymore. And I need you to understand that that uncertainty is not cruelty. It is just the truth. He was quiet. He did not try to argue or fix or redirect. That, the narrator noted, was growth. It did not come naturally to apex predators. The ability to sit inside someone else's pain without immediately attempting to solve it into something more manageable. He was learning it in real time, visibly, at some cost. I know, he said. I don't know if my wolf will ever fully wake up. I don't know if the bond still functions after a formal rejection. I don't know if I can walk back into that pack and be looked at again by people who watched and said nothing. And I don't know if I can trust you. And I need you to understand that that last part is not about whether I believe you. I believe you. I'm telling you I don't know if I can trust myself to stay when it gets hard. Because I have learned very thoroughly how to leave. The forest was quiet around them. Somewhere above the canopy, the blood moon continued its patient, indifferent arc. I'm not asking you to trust me, Lucian said. I'm asking you to let me try to deserve it. She stared at him for a long time. That, she said finally, is dangerously reasonable. I've had 8 months to practice. Something moved across her face, too fast to name. She looked away. Don't leave tonight, he said. That's all, just not tonight. She didn't leave that night. She told herself it was because it was dark and the path back to the road was steep, and she was tired after 2 days of travel and 1 mating ceremony interruption. All of these things were true. None of them were the reason. Morning arrived the way mornings do after nights that have rearranged something fundamental, tentatively, with the quality of light that seems almost apologetic. Ma Eloise was sitting on the low stone wall outside the pack house's east wing with a cup of tea she had made herself, because she had found the kitchen through sheer stubbornness, and she was not going to ask anyone for anything when Vivian Cossart found her. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Someone polished and guarded, maybe. Someone performing graciousness across a distance. What she got was a woman of about her own age with sharp eyes and an expression of barely contained fury that took Eloise a moment to identify as being directed not at her, but for her. Vivian sat down on the wall without asking, wrapped her hands around her own cup, and said without preamble, I want you to know that I think what was done to you was one of the most revolting abuses of pack law I have ever witnessed. And I agreed to help Lucian find you specifically because I wanted to be able to say that to your face. Eloise blinked. All right, she said. I also want you to know that I am not in love with your mate. I am in love with someone else entirely and have been for 4 years, and the political convenience of appearing unavailable has been genuinely useful to me, so this arrangement has not been without its benefits. Who? Her name is Nadia, Vivian said. She lives in a village called Caldervane. We haven't, it's complicated, but she's there and I'm here and the distance has been... She stopped, pressed her lips together. Her surname is Osei. The word landed in the space between them. Eloise set her tea down very carefully on the stone wall. Nadia Osei, she said. Vivian went completely still. You know her? She has been my closest friend, Eloise said in the voice of someone doing complex arithmetic in real time, for 2.5 years. The silence that followed was enormous. It had texture. It had weather. It was the silence of two women sitting on a wall in the early morning light, separately processing the information that the world was significantly, almost offensively, smaller than either of them had believed. Eloise's reaction, and this deserved to be appreciated fully, was to pick her tea back up, look at it, put it back down, and say out loud to no one in particular, "I need a very large drink." She did not get one. The morning had other plans. Vivian started laughing, not politely, genuinely. The slightly unhinged laughter of someone whose carefully managed situation has just become considerably more complicated. Eloise looked at her for a moment, and then, despite everything, despite 3 years and 400 miles and 1 night in the forest that had rearranged her interior architecture, she laughed too. It didn't fix anything. It didn't resolve the question of the ceremony or the bond or the pack or the long, complicated work that trust required when it had been broken this thoroughly. But it was real, which was more than most things had been in 3 years. Later, much later, when the laughter had settled and Vivian had gone inside and the morning had stretched into the particular golden hour before midday, Eloise stood and looked at the pack house. It was a large building of dark timber and iron. I set into the mountainside like it had grown there. She had been inside it years ago, briefly, in the early days of being identified as the Alpha's potential mate, before everything had gone wrong. She remembered the way it smelled, stone and wood smoke and the particular mineral scent of mountain water. She looked at it for a long time. She would stay 1 more day, just to see how the morning felt, just 1 more day. She had said that yesterday. She strongly suspected she would say it again tomorrow. Somewhere outside Caldervane, tied to a post outside the record-keeper's office, a mule named Biscuit had absolutely no idea what was happening to his owner. He was eating hay. He was unbothered. Eloise envied him more than she could adequately express. But if this story is doing something to your chest right now, if you're already feeling it, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Because Chapter 3 is where everything changes. And I mean everything. Chapter 3. What her wolf carried. They had been arguing for 40 minutes. This was, by Eloise's count, the 3rd argument of the day and the 7th since she had arrived in Iron Vale, which meant they were averaging roughly 2.5 arguments per day, which was either a sign of profound incompatibility or, more troublingly, the most honest communication either of them had managed in 3 years. Possibly both. She hadn't decided yet. The current argument was about where she was sleeping. Specifically, Lucian's position was that she should sleep in the pack house, in one of the guest quarters, like a person who was staying. Eloise's position was that she had not decided she was staying, that sleeping in the pack house felt like a decision she had not made, and that the distinction mattered even if it looked identical from the outside. Lucian's counterposition was that the alternative was a cart on a mountain road, and he was not, as Alpha King, capable of allowing that. Eloise's counter position was that she had been sleeping in considerably worse arrangements for 3 years, and she had not asked for his permission or his concern. They were standing at the edge of the forest path, in the particular charged darkness of the second night of the blood moon, and they were both, though neither would have admitted it under any available form of pressure, more alive than they had felt in years. There was something about the arguing that was almost a relief. It required presence. It required full attention. It was the opposite of the careful, a managed distance they had both been living inside, and some part of each of them recognized it, even while the rest of them kept disagreeing about guest quarters. "I am not asking you to commit to anything," Lucian was saying. "I am asking you to sleep inside a building rather than... I have told you the cart is perfectly... Eloise, would you just..." She stopped. Not because she had run out of words. She had plenty of words. She stopped because something happened in her body that overrode language entirely. A wave of heat that moved from her sternum outward, sudden and total, like a door being opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. She had felt this before. The phantom warmth that healers in Caldervane had told her was her body's memory of what a shift might feel like, a biological echo of something absent, when she had learned to name it nothing. She had gotten very good at naming it nothing. But this was not the familiar, manageable warmth she had learned to dismiss. This was pressure. She doubled over. Lucian was at her side before she had fully registered the movement, one hand on her shoulder, one at her back, the alpha's instinct for proximity to injury moving faster than thought. "Eloise, I'm fine. You're not..." "I said I'm fine, it's just..." She pressed a hand to her sternum. The pressure was extraordinary. Not painful, exactly. Something more like the feeling of a breath held for 3 years finally, inevitably, needing to release. "It happens sometimes. It's nothing. It's not nothing." The way he said it made her look up at him. His hands were still on her and his face had changed, the argument gone from it entirely, yet replaced by something focused and still and very intent. His eyes had dropped to her chest, not in attention to her, but in attention to something he could apparently hear or sense through his palms. "Eloise," he said very quietly, "there's something. I know," she said. And the way she said it stopped him completely. "Not I know, you're overreacting. Not I know, it's fine." The way she said it was the way someone speaks about a thing they have been aware of for a long time and have made a private arrangement with. Quiet, almost resigned. The voice of someone who has named a thing that lives with them and has decided the naming is enough. "How long?" he said. "Always," she said. "Since the beginning. Since after." He didn't move his hands. She didn't ask him to. "It's not nothing," he said again. Softer this time. She closed her eyes. Here is what Bramwell's letter had not fully explained. What even Bramwell, in his careful dying confession, had not fully understood. Veiled emergence is not a passive condition. The literature, what little exists, 3 documented cases across 4 centuries of recorded pack history, describes it as a dormancy, a waiting, as though the wolf simply pauses at some point in its development and resumes when conditions allow. This description is accurate in the way that saying a river is water moving is accurate, technically correct, profoundly insufficient. In Eloise's case, the rarest variant, the one Bramwell had identified too late and understood even later. What happened was not dormancy. It was a choice. When the rejection happened, when Lucian said those words in that circle and the mate bond, that ancient, a fundamental moon-written thing was severed without her consent, and the pain arrived in full. It arrived as something unsurvivable. Not metaphorically, clinically, biologically unsurvivable. A mate bond rejection in a wolf with Eloise's level of connection is not heartbreak. It is closer to having something structural removed from the body without anesthetic. The wolf half of her, still unmaterialized, still waiting for its emergence, felt the severance with every receptor it had. And so it made a decision. It locked itself away, deliberately, completely, with the particular selflessness of something that loves its other half more than it loves its own existence. It took the pain, all of it, every fractured piece of 3 years of severed bond, and it pulled it inward, away from her. It swallowed the wound whole and carried it in the dark, in the sealed room of its own unmaterialized consciousness, so that the human half of Eloise Parra could keep walking, keep breathing, keep building a quiet life in a mountain village with a mule and a record-keeping job and black tea in the mornings. Keep surviving. For 3 years, Eloise had been surviving on sheer human will. She had not known. She had thought the warmth was phantom, thought the pressure was grief residue, thought the doubled heartbeat she occasionally felt was a medical curiosity the Caldervane healers could find no name for. She had not known that the thing she felt living alongside her, silent and patient and immovable, was her own wolf, sitting in the dark with 3 years of her pain in its arms, waiting for the moment it could safely give it back. The blood moon, the territory of the bond's origin. Lucian's hands on her, steady and warm and present, all of it together, arriving at once, and something in her wolf finally, recognizing the word it had been waiting for. Safe. Safe now. You can let go. What emerged from Eloise Parra on the second night of the blood moon was not graceful. It was not cinematic. It was not the silver, radiant transformation the old texts described when they spoke of wolves finding their form for the first time. It was 3 years of stored grief released in approximately 4 minutes. She cried, not quietly, not with any dignity whatsoever. Great, heaving, completely uncontrolled crying, the kind that takes the whole body and doesn't ask permission, the kind she had refused to do in that ceremonial circle 3 years ago when 500 wolves were watching and she had decided they would not have her tears. They hadn't gotten them then. They came now, in the dark forest with no audience, because the body always collects what it is owed. Her wolf emerged in fragments, first as gold flooding into her eyes, not the controlled bleed of an alpha's shift, but a total ignition, sudden and complete. Then, as shaking that moved through her hands and up her arms, then slowly, breathtakingly, as the silver, just at the edges first, a luminescence along her skin, a shimmer at her fingertips, the beginning of something enormous, the first whisper of what she actually was. Lucian sat down on the ground. He pulled her with him, or she fell toward him. The sequence was unclear and irrelevant. He sat on the forest floor with his back against a tree and his arms around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and her wolf gave back 3 years of everything it had been carrying, and he held all of it. He did not try to stop it or shorten it or redirect it into something more manageable. He held it. He said, "I've got you," twice. That was sufficient. Morning arrived with the particular gentleness of something that understands it is entering a room that has been through a great deal. The forest was quiet and gold and cool. Eloise sat at the base of the same tree, her back against the bark, her hands in her lap, and felt for the first time in 3 years like she was fully inhabiting her own body. Her wolf was not fully present. It would take time. The shift had been partial, the emergence only begun. The silver that had appeared at her fingertips already faded back. But it was awake. She could feel it the way you feel a room that has been opened after a long winter. The air different. The quality of the space changed, something breathing in it that hadn't been breathing before. She was looking at her hands when she became aware that Lucian was watching her. She didn't tell him to stop. That was the progress. Small, unremarked, but real. She let him look. Let him have the small, quiet thing of seeing her in the morning light after everything the night had asked of both of them. He was leaning against the tree beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and his face was doing something she had no word for, something that had been waiting a long time to happen. She was about to say something. She wasn't certain what, just that the silence had reached the kind of fullness that wants shape, when the sound of boots on the forest path made them both look up. One of the border guards, young, formal, moving with the particular energy of someone carrying information they were not sure how to deliver. He delivered it to Lucian with his eyes on the ground. The Eastern Coalition had arrived at the Iron Veil border at dawn. Not with soldiers, not with weapons, with a document, a formal challenge of legitimacy filed under ancient pack law, witnessed by 3 neutral territory representatives bearing the seals of 4 Eastern Alpha houses. The law was clear. Had always been clear. If a sacred claiming ceremony was interrupted, if the ritual was begun and not completed within its designated blood moon cycle, the Alpha's claim to leadership could be formally challenged. The challenge required a response. The response was completion of the ceremony or abdication of the challenge's terms. The blood moon cycle ended tonight. If Lucian did not complete the ceremony by moonrise, the Davila crown faced a legitimate leadership vacuum. The Eastern Coalition had 3 candidate alphas ready to press their claims by morning. The guard finished speaking and stood very still, waiting. Lucian looked at the document for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. "Tell the Border Watch to hold position. Extend the Coalition's representatives formal hospitality. Do not let them inside the inner territory." The guard left. The forest was quiet again. Eloise looked at Lucian. Lucian looked at the document. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." "Tonight." She nodded slowly. He stood, folded the document, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just identified the next several hours of his life as requiring significant navigation. Then he went to face the council. The new council, the 3 who hadn't been arrested, 2 who had been hastily appointed in the subsequent reorganization, 1 elder woman named Petra, who had been trying to reform pack governance for 15 years and was experiencing the current situation with the expression of someone watching their predictions come true in the most chaotic possible way, received Lucian in the formal meeting chamber at mid-morning. They wanted Vivian. Of course they wanted Vivian. The Western Ridge Alliance was structured and safe and represented everything a challenged throne needed at this particular moment. They made their case respectfully, thoroughly, and with the reasonable tone of people who believed they were right. Lucian let them finish. "I'll complete the ritual tonight," he said. "With Lady Cossart?" Elder Petra said. "No." The room went very still. "Your Majesty." This from the council's newest appointee, a young man named Renfew, who had not yet learned to modulate his alarm. "If you mean to suggest the Hollow Woman." Lucian turned his head toward Renfew with the slow, deliberate precision of a large predator identifying a sound. "Her name," he said, in a voice that was very quiet and therefore extremely dangerous, "is Eloise Para. She is not a hollow. She is my true mate. She is a veiled emergence wolf, and she underwent her first partial shift last night on the second night of the blood moon in front of 12 witnesses, including your own head recorder, whose signed account is currently sitting on my desk. So I suggest you update your records, update your language, and prepare the obsidian altar, because tonight I am finishing what the moon started 3 years ago." Nobody spoke. "You're dismissed," Lucian said pleasantly. They left. He stood alone in the war room. The document from the Eastern Coalition was on the table. The morning light came through the high, iron-framed windows and fell across the floor in long, clean lines. He counted them, briefly, for no reason. 30 seconds. Then, out loud to the empty room, "Now I have to go ask her." A pause. "She's going to be furious." He was correct. He had faced down rogue alphas at the northern border. He had navigated a succession crisis at 26 with no preparation and no margin for error. He had survived 3 years of being the man who had done the thing he had done, which required a particular and ongoing form of endurance that didn't have a name in any language he knew. Nothing, not one moment of any of it, had prepared him for walking across the Iron Vale courtyard to ask Eloise Para if she wanted to be queen by sundown. He went anyway. Chapter 4. What Healed People Build. He found her sitting on the low stone wall behind the east wing, which had apparently become her wall. She had claimed it through sheer repetition over 3 days, the way people claim spaces not by asking, but by returning to them until the space understands it belongs to them now. She was looking at the mountains. He sat down beside her and said nothing for a moment, which she noted, because Lucian not immediately filling silence with strategy was still a relatively new development, and she was tracking it the way you track new growth on something you weren't certain had survived the winter. Then he told her about the document, the challenge, the timeline, tonight. She was quiet for a very long time after he finished. "So," she said. "Yes." "You need an answer. By moonrise." I want to be clear that I am not asking you because of the document. The document is a separate problem that I will handle regardless of what you decide. I am asking you because... Lucian. Because you deserve to be asked properly, and I have been trying to find the right moment for 8 months, and apparently the universe has opinions about my timeline. Lucian. He stopped. She turned to look at him fully. He looked back. The morning light was doing something to his face that she was choosing not to think about too carefully. "I," she said, measuring each word, "own 4 changes of clothes, and a mule named Biscuit who is currently tied to a post outside Caldervane because I told the woman at the record office I would be back in a week. That was 5 days ago. He has opinions about being kept waiting. Loud ones." I'll send someone for Biscuit. That is not... He'll have his own stable. The royal stables are very comfortable. There's a gray mare named... Lucian. He stopped. She held up one hand. He waited. She stood up from the wall, which she did when she needed to think with her whole body, and she walked 3 paces and turned back and looked at him sitting there in the morning light. This impossible, exhausting, entirely unhinged man who had used a sacred mating ceremony as a search operation and was currently prepared to personally arrange accommodation for her mule, and she felt something move through her that she had no clean name for. Something that had been building for 3 days, or possibly 3 years, and had reached the particular mass where it was going to become words whether she authorized it or not. I need you to hear me, she said, because I am only going to say this once and I am not going to dress it up. He was very still, listening. I am not doing this for the pack. They watched, Lucian. Every single one of them watched and said nothing, and I have not yet decided what I am going to do with that. So I am not doing this for them. I am not doing this for the throne. I spent 3 years being a record keeper in a mountain village, and I was genuinely good at it, and some days I miss it. So it is not the throne. And I am not doing this to save your political situation, which, and I want this acknowledged, you created yourself with your extremely dramatic forest chase. The corner of his mouth moved. What I am doing it for, she said, is this. My wolf chose yours before either of us had a say in it. Before we were old enough to understand what that meant or what it would cost or what it would require of us. It chose, and then someone decided that choice was inconvenient, and they spent 22 years and 3 more trying to make us forget it had ever happened. And I am done. She paused. I am tired. I am tired of the running and the distance and the quiet life that was safe, but was also, if I am being completely honest, missing something at its center that I could feel the absence of every single morning. I am tired of running from the one thing that was always actually mine. The mountains were very bright behind her. The blood moon was long gone, hidden behind daylight now, but she could feel its 3rd night approaching in her bones. Her wolf could feel it, awake and present and patient. Also, she added, Vivian and Nadia are going to need someone to help them navigate their situation, and I have apparently been involved in it without knowing for 2.5 years. I feel a sense of responsibility. Lucian stared at her. You're partly staying to manage your friend's love life. I am a very dedicated friend. Eloise. Yes, Lucian, I'll stay. He exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was not the exhale of a man performing relief. It was the exhale of someone who has been holding a breath for 8 months, or 3 years, depending on where you started counting, and has finally, simply, been allowed to let it go. He didn't reach for her. He had learned something about that. About letting her move first, about not filling space she hadn't offered. She stood 3 paces away and looked at him, and then she crossed the distance herself, all of it, and she stood on her toes and she pressed her forehead to the line of his jaw. The wolf gesture for I see you. You're real. You're here. She stayed there for 4 seconds. 4. She counted. She didn't know why she always counted. Maybe because 4 seconds had been the last honest thing between them once, and now she was giving them back, not as a wound, but as something else, a beginning disguised as a number. Then she stepped back. Go prepare your altar, she said, And if the ceremony involves any public howling, I need at minimum 1 hour of practice. I have been suppressing that particular instinct for 3 years, and I refuse to embarrass myself in front of the Eastern Coalition. She howled magnificently, for the record. The obsidian altar looked different at night under the third blood moon than it had 2 nights ago when Eloise had watched it from the shadows. Up close, it was older than she had realized. The founding symbols worn smooth by centuries of hands, the stone itself carrying a particular cold that seemed less about temperature and more about time, about the accumulated weight of every bond that had been declared here before theirs. The pack was assembled. 500 wolves in their ceremonial formation, facing inward, the same configuration as 3 years ago, but carrying a completely different quality of silence. That silence had been the silence of a verdict. This one was the silence of people who were, most of them, not entirely sure what they were about to witness and had enough collective memory of how wrongly things had gone before to be holding their breath about it. The Eastern Coalition representatives stood at the outer border, formally hosted, technically guests, actually there to watch the ceremony fail. They had their document ready. They had their 3 candidate alphas standing by. They were patient, organized, and confident. Lucian stood at the altar. Eloise walked into the clearing. She had borrowed a dress from Vivian, dark blue, simply cut, nothing ceremonial about it except that it was clean and it fit, and Vivian had pressed it with a flat iron, and the expression of a woman who was going to send her friend into her mating ceremony looking like herself and not like a political prop. Eloise had her hair the way she always wore it. She had the scar along her left collarbone, visible above the neckline, which she had decided she was not covering because it was hers, and she had earned it, and it was staying. She walked to the altar. Lucian looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 3 days, like a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about what he was capable of surviving. And she looked back at him with the level directness that had always been her particular brand of armor, except that this time it wasn't armor. This time it was just her face. Open, present, tired of being anything other than exactly what she was. The ritual began, and the air changed. Not dramatically, not with visible light or audible sound or any of the cinematic signals that stories tend to use for moments like this. It changed the way a room changes when someone you love walks into it. A shift in quality, in warmth, in the specific texture of being alive in that particular space. The resonance moved outward from the altar in a slow, warm current, reaching the first row of assembled wolves and moving through them and continuing, unstoppable, to the last. Elder wolves who had attended a dozen ceremonies in their lifetimes went still. Not the stillness of ceremony or respect, the stillness of recognition, of suddenly remembering something they had forgotten was supposed to feel like this. Some of them had begun to believe, quietly, privately, in the way you believe things you would never say aloud, that the old accounts were exaggerated, that bonds didn't actually sing, that the resonance was a metaphor. It was not a metaphor. Eloise's wolf rose. It rose the way it had been rising for 3 days, in fragments, in increments, in the slow reclamation of something that had been locked away for longer than it should have been. But this time the blood moon was overhead, and the altar stone was cold under her palms, and Lucian's eyes were on hers, and all the conditions that her wolf had been waiting for were finally, completely, simultaneously present. The silver came fully this time. It moved across her skin like light through water. Not the partial shimmer of 2 nights ago, but the whole thing, complete and unhidden, luminous in the dark. She was tall in it, enormous. The kind of wolf that appeared in old texts and old paintings, and the kind of stories Pax told their children about the times when the moon was paying very close attention. A moonbound, but a power that had been concentrating for 25 years, deepened by everything it had carried, refined by everything that had tried to suppress it. It rose in the ceremonial clearing of the iron veil, and every wolf present felt it in their bones like a second heartbeat. At the outer border, the Eastern Coalition's lead alpha, a large, experienced, thoroughly unsentimental man named Croft, who had been pressing political claims for 20 years and had an excellent record of reading rooms, felt it reach him across the distance. He stood very still for a moment. Then he reached into his formal coat and removed the Challenge of Legitimacy document. He folded it once, twice, and tucked it into his inner pocket. "Stand down," he said to his men. "It's over." The Iron Veil mountain range had not felt a bond like this in 4 generations. Several elder wolves cried during the declaration. They will deny this categorically and with great conviction if asked. There are 12 witnesses. The head recorder's account is signed, dated, and filed. The bonfire was still burning 2 hours later when Nadia found them. Eloise saw her coming across the courtyard, her closest friend for 2.5 years. The woman who had shared tea with her on cold mornings in Caldervane and listened to her talk around the edges of a wound she never fully named, who had known Eloise's history only in outline and had loved her anyway with the quiet, sturdy faithfulness of someone who understands that people are more than the worst things that happen to them. Nadia was holding something, a journal, leather-bound and old, the kind that has been handled enough times to carry the particular worn softness of something important. She stopped in front of Eloise and held it out. "He left it for you," she said. "My grandfather, he said..." Her voice was steady but careful, the way voices are when they're carrying something heavy. "He said to give it to you when the time was right. I've been carrying it for 3 months. I didn't know when right was." She looked at the bonfire for a moment. "I think it's now." Eloise took the journal. She opened it to the page marked with a folded slip of paper. She read. Bramwell's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life recording things that mattered and had understood the weight of accuracy. The entry was dated 14 months before his death. It was headed simply, "What I found. What I should have found sooner. What I am sorry for." The confession she already knew, the falsified records, the veiled emergence, the deliberate deception, was in the earlier pages. What was on this page was something else. Something Bramwell had found only in the last year of his life, when he had gone back through every record he had ever kept, looking for the full shape of what had been done. Elderbrandt had not merely falsified the diagnostic. He had made the diagnosis necessary. The dormancy, the veiled emergence itself, had been induced. Before Eloise could walk, before she could speak. At her naming ceremony, when the Pax tradition was to anoint infants with blessed oil as a mark of welcome and belonging, Elderbrandt had added something to the oil, a compound, old alchemical knowledge, the kind that predated current pack medicine by centuries, documented in texts that most healers considered theoretical, a suppressant, Because Brant had performed a pre-emergence diagnostic on the infant Eloise Para, a routine procedure done for all wolf-born children at naming, and he had seen what she was going to be. He had seen the wolf waiting inside her, still unmaterialized, still years from its emergence, and he had seen its power. Moon-bound, the kind that appeared twice in a century. The kind that historically, in pack record, had always changed things, and he had decided, before she was old enough to form her first memory, that change was not something he was willing to risk. He had suppressed a child's wolf to control what she might become. Her wolf hadn't emerged late because of a condition. Her wolf hadn't emerged late at all. It had been stolen from her, in the first year of her life, by a man who looked at an infant and saw a threat. Eloise sat with the journal for a very long time. The fire crackled. The pack celebrated around them at a respectful distance. Lucian sat beside her on the ground. He had folded himself down onto the earth next to her without ceremony when she started reading, and he had not spoken, and had not moved, and had not attempted to locate the silver lining or redirect the weight of it into something more manageable. He had simply stayed. He was learning, slowly, that staying was sometimes the entirety of what was needed. She thought about the girl she had never gotten to be. 15 years old and silver in the forest, running for the first time. As whole and complete and terrifyingly powerful and entirely herself. That girl had never existed. She had been prevented from existing by a man with a compound and a fear of what she represented. Eloise sat with the grief of that. Let it be exactly as large as it actually was, didn't make it smaller or more bearable or more resolved than it was. And then slowly, in the same breath, she thought about her wolf. 22 years of chemical suppression, 3 more years of voluntary sacrifice, of choosing to carry the rejection's pain so that her human half could survive it. 25 years in the dark, in total, without complaint, without abandonment, without a single moment of the leaving that would have been so much easier. Her wolf had never left her. Not when Brant poisoned it in infancy, not when Lucian's words severed the bond. Not through 400 miles of exile and 3 years of quiet survival in a village that knew nothing of what she carried. It had stayed. It had held everything. It had loved her, in the only way it had available to it, silently, completely, at extraordinary personal cost, for her entire life. She looked up at the moon. It was past its peak now, moving toward the western mountains, still enormous, still rust-red at its edges, patient and indifferent and very old. Her wolf lifted its voice. It rose from somewhere at the center of her. Full-throated, clear, the sound of something that has been waiting an extremely long time to be heard and is done waiting now. It rose and it carried, and it hit the face of the Iron Vale Mountains, and came back changed, the echo adding something to it. The stone and the peaks and the night air between them giving it back bigger than it had gone out. The mountain range echoed with it. Lucian's hand found hers in the dark. She let it. 6 months later, Eloise Para reorganized the council's entire filing system on a Wednesday afternoon because it was structured in a way that made cross-referencing historical precedent unnecessarily complicated, and she had mentioned this at 2 consecutive council meetings, and nothing had happened, and she had therefore handled it herself. The council was baffled. They had expected many things from a moon-bound queen with 3 years of exile and a complicated history with the pack's institutional memory. Alphabetical subcategorization by decade had not been among their predictions. Lucian found out at dinner when 3 council members mentioned it with the expressions of people who were not certain whether they had been helped or gently reprimanded. He was deeply, privately, completely endeared. He would die before saying this aloud. She already knew. Her wolf ran freely now, silver and enormous and entirely herself, moving through the Ironvale forests in the early mornings before the pack woke, learning the territory she had been kept from with the particular thoroughness of someone making up for lost time. She was not graceful about it yet. She had 25 years of missed practice to account for, and she fell over her own feet with a frequency that she was choosing to describe as endearing rather than humbling. Lucian had witnessed 3 separate incidents. He had said nothing. He had the survival instincts of a man who wished to remain married. Nadia arrived from Caldervane 6 weeks after the ceremony, having sent Biscuit ahead with a very apologetic note to Eloise explaining that the mule had bitten the postal carrier, and she felt this was important to disclose up front. Biscuit settled into the royal stables with the entitled ease of an animal that had always believed he deserved better, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up. Nadia and Vivian navigated their beginning with the particular awkward grace of 2 people who have loved each other from a distance for 4 years, and now have to figure out what to do with proximity. There were several difficult conversations, and at least one night where Eloise sat in a hallway outside a closed door being morally supportive while eating an apple. Because she was a very dedicated friend and also deeply invested in this outcome. Their declaration ceremony, 3 months later, was small and quiet and entirely theirs. Eloise attended wearing an expression of profound personal satisfaction that she made no attempt to moderate. Elder Brant was found in the eastern outlands in the 2nd month, brought back under formal guard, tried before the full pack under the oldest laws they had, the ones that predated politics and concerned themselves only with harm done to the innocent, and exiled. Not to death, not to spectacle, just removed. His titles dissolved, his name struck from the formal record of the pack's leadership history, his legacy reduced to a cautionary footnote in the healer's training texts. The pack moved forward. That was the choice they made. Forward. It's with their eyes open, with the full knowledge of what had been done in their name by people they had trusted. Bramwell O'C's portrait was hung in the healer's hall. Not in the place of honor. That was reserved for people who had done the right thing from the beginning. His portrait went on the east wall, below the window, with a small plaque that said only his name and dates, and, beneath them, he told the truth when it cost him something. It counts. Lucian learned across those 6 months the things that did not come naturally to apex predators and kings. How to say I was wrong without immediately pivoting to corrective action. How to sit inside someone else's pain without needing to fix it into something easier to hold. How to ask for help with the particular humility of someone who has spent years confusing control with strength and is slowly, carefully learning the difference. He learned it from Eloise, who had learned it in Caldervane, in a record-keeper's office, writing down other people's stories with the accuracy they deserved, who had understood, through years of that work, that the most important thing you could do with someone's truth was hold it carefully, write it down exactly as it was, not make it smaller, not make it prettier, just true. They say a moon-bound wolf appears when the pack needs something more than power. when it needs proof that what was broken can become something stronger at the fracture point, that the things survived don't disappear when safety finally arrives, but become instead the foundation that safety is built on. Eloise Parra did not save the Iron Veil with her wolf or her title or the political stability of a completed bond. She saved it by refusing, at every possible point, across every mile of distance, through every year of exile and silence, to be less than completely honest about what she had survived and what she still wanted. Lucien Davila calls it the most terrifying and wonderful thing he has ever witnessed in his life. He tells her this regularly. She tells him he is dramatic. He is. They are somehow perfect. You just stayed until the end. And if this story moved something in you, if Eloise's wolf and what it carried and what it refused to let go of got into your chest and stayed there, then you already know this channel is home. Hit that like button. Subscribe, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. And drop in the comments where you're watching from, because the people who find their way to a story like this from every corner of the world, that community is the whole point. You're not just a viewer here. You're exactly the kind of person this was made for. We'll see you in the next one.